Good morning. Or good afternoon for those of you on the East Coast. This is Jerry Green from the Pacific Council, and I am delighted to welcome you. I probably should start again. Good morning, everybody, except those of you on the East Coast. Good afternoon. This is Jerry Green from Los Angeles from the Pacific Council. I want to welcome you to our event. We have two extraordinarily distinguished speakers, and I'm going to go on a little bit at length introducing them because I want you to have a sense of how lucky we are today. And then I will fade into the background, and our speakers and Val, my colleague, will take over. I want to begin by introducing Ambassador Mark Green. He's from a different branch of the Green. He's from the Wisconsin Greens. I'm the Massachusetts. He's the successful part of the family. I'm the one from Boston. Ambassador Green, who is a former ambassador, is the president, director, and CEO of the Wilson Center in Washington. The Wilson Center is a national treasure. It is chartered by Congress. It is aggressively nonpartisan, and they are incredibly wonderful and generous partners to the Pacific Council. We do a lot with the Wilson Center, and I am always deeply impressed at the expertise that's to be found there. They have the leading Mexico studies program in the world, I mean, in Washington, D.C. So there are lots of examples, and we have a wonderful relationship with them. Ambassador Green is also the author of the Stubborn Things blog, which I would commend to you. From 2017 to 2020, Ambassador Green served as the administrator of USAID, which is an increasingly important organization given climate change. I realize we were told last night climate change is a hoax, and I certainly wouldn't argue with this guy, but I think there are others who don't share that view. And from the promontory of AID, you get to see the world, at its saddest, but also perhaps the promise and potential if the United States steps up and does the right thing. He was also president of the International Republican Institute, IRI, which is part of the IRI, NDI, NED, a family of organizations, all of which are deeply committed to the promotion of democracy. And we need their wisdom and their action, not only globally, but also, I would argue, domestically within the United States. Ambassador Green is also former executive director of the McCain Institute. As many of you know, we have a close relationship with the McCain Institute. Senator McCain was a frequent visitor to Los Angeles and to the Pacific Council, and has many fans in our membership. And he was also president of the Initiative for Global Development, as well as senior director at the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. Ambassador Green served as the U.S. ambassador from Tanzania, to Tanzania, not from Tanzania, from 2007 to early 2009. And he was a four-term member of the United States House of Representatives, representing Wisconsin's 8th district. And I can't help but say this, God will smite me. I will be punished. After watching this clown car last night, I can't, help but wish, why don't people like Ambassador Green, run for the roses? He's an enormously capable person, and shows, half of our political spectrum at its best. I also want to introduce our colleague, Dr. Sarah Smith. Dr. Smith leads the Homelessness, Refugees, and Safe Water Initiative, as well as the disaster and program-related investments for the Conrad Hilton Foundation, which is around the corner from me in Agora Hills, California. We are lucky to have our own global treasures in Los Angeles. The Hilton Foundation is certainly one of them. They give out the Hilton Humanitarian Award every fall, which is the eyes of the world are on it, and it's really, really important. Dr. Smith has worked in the humanitarian sector throughout Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East for 25 years. And prior to joining Hilton, she was the head of education, children protection, and youth livelihoods for the International Rescue Committee. At IRC, Dr. Smith led the design for several historic programs, including Ahlan Simsin, for those of all of us Arabic speakers in the audience, is Hello Sesame Street, It was an early childhood development initiative with the Sesame Workshop for Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, and it won the MacArthur Foundation's inaugural $100 million award, and it richly deserved. So Ahlan Simsim is you know, I don't know if it still exists, but it was a wonderful thing, and I hope it still exists. Dr. Smith began her career as a Head Start teacher. She was a preschool teacher, in Ohio, and she was also a Peace Corps volunteer in Namibia. So we have two real experts on the continent that we love to tell China and Russia to stay away from, but in which we certainly could be doing more to perhaps provide African nations a viable and practical alternative to Russia and the Chinese. Dr. Smith earned a master's degree in international policy from Harvard University. I'm from Boston, I get to say Harvard, and a doctorate in education from Columbia Teachers College. Sorry for the long introduction, but you have treasures and jewels. You really need to showcase them. So I am going to fade into the background and join the audience. Mark Green, Sarah Smith, thank you so much for doing this. What you're going to talk about is always important. It is, uniquely important at this moment in history. So my thanks to you both, as well as to Val and Sam, my colleagues.
Thank you, Jerry, and thanks so much to the Pacific Council for inviting us. Ambassador Green, it's really an honor to be here with you. I am excited to ask you a few questions, and then I'll turn our conversation over to the audience. So you all know we're here to talk about drought, war, and more, and food insecurity as our topic of the afternoon or morning, wherever you are. And everyone here probably is well aware that food insecurity has reached record levels. It's, according to latest data, I think around 349 million people across 79 countries facing crisis levels of hunger. It's impossible to imagine what that number really looks like, I think. And the trend is going in the wrong direction. This is an all-time high, and it's obviously very connected to conflict, which disrupts agricultural production. It's also related to climate change and economic instability that was only made worse by the COVID crisis and the pandemic. So, Ambassador Green, maybe let's start with just the state of play. What can you tell us about the current situation? Are you seeing any bright spots, any additional areas of concern?
Great. Thanks, Sarah. And thanks to the Hilton Foundation, great partners of ours on a number of fronts. And Dr. Jerry Green and the Pacific Council, thank you for having me. I should say, Jerry, my father's name was Jerry. And believe it or not, I was actually born in Boston myself. So who knows? We may not be such disparate branches of the Green family after all. So some months ago, Kristalina Georgieva, director of the IMF, International Monetary Fund, was at the Wilson Center. And I asked her how she would characterize these times that we're living in. And she talked about living in a shock-prone world. And I've really come to see that I think that resonates. I think that's an accurate characterization. We have shocks that are driven by bad guys, whether it be Venezuela's Maduro or Ortega in Nicaragua or Vladimir Putin. Some of it's driven by war and conflict, what's happening in Syria, what's happening in Ukraine. And some of it is a consequence of climate volatility and weather extremes. But the largest number are driven by or are driving a combination of these factors. And that's really what makes these challenges, I think, so difficult. At the Wilson Center, it's increasingly a large part of our work, our environmental change and security program, our refugees and forced displacement initiative, which Hilton has been a supporter of. They're large parts of our work, in part because these issues are so very important to American leadership, to foreign policy, and quite frankly, to the future, economic future of the world. The numbers are overwhelming, and you laid them out. I think the best way to think of these challenges is to refine and sharpen them. So we have challenges of food security and food assistance, and that largely is a humanitarian relief issue, right? It's humanitarian assistance, food assistance. And then there's what I call food sovereignty, food systems, food infrastructure, and that's more of a development challenge and a development issue. On the food assistance front, let's face it, the picture is very dark. On the positive side, at least in terms of self-image, America is far and away the largest donor in the world of food assistance and humanitarian relief, and quite frankly, nobody else comes even close. The problem with that is these numbers, the food assistance, which I think is generous, is nowhere near the demand. It's nowhere near meeting the need. And also the food assistance we do provide increasingly can't go as far. Costs are being driven up by war, by inflation. The money simply isn't going as far as it once did. In East Africa, and I just came out of a quick trip to East Africa, the cost of food, that basic food basket, is up 60% in the last 2 years. And for people who are subsistence farmers and living on a very small budget, this is real. This is a matter of life and death. Then the separate issue of food sovereignty, food systems, infrastructure, that's significantly impacted by climate fallout. And from that trip I took to East Africa and Zanzibar, part of Tanzania, I had a chance to ask the president of Zanzibar what he was seeing in terms of climate fallout. And he said some interesting things to me. He said, first off, there's seasonal unpredictability. Farmers don't know when they're going to have the chance to go into the field. That really threatens their livelihoods and quite frankly threatens their families. Secondly, in Zanzibar is an archipelago, a series of islands. He said warming water means that they have different fish than they are accustomed to having. And that changes their habits, not only in nutrition and what they're able to harvest, but also what they're able to sell. And then third, he told me, and this I really wasn't prepared for, he said that the changing climate is causing saltwater seepage into freshwater supplies, which is not something I had thought about. And so he said increasingly in parts of Africa, those freshwater supplies that farmers count upon are under threat. They're at risk. And so that's deeply disturbing. Now, when we take a look again at food assistance and food security or food sovereignty, there's another threat that I'm worried about a great deal. And that is, I'm worried that the skyrocketing demand for humanitarian assistance and humanitarian relief is beginning to cannibalize the investments that we need to make on the development side of the shop. We have some marvelous technologies, and that gets towards the bright spots. There really is exciting new technology coming onto the market, and the know-how that we have in the area of food and those long-term, the drought-resistant seeds, the technology that we have on the storage front, the SMS technology and apps that are available that help farmers know when to, when they can harvest and when they can water and when they can plant. That's all marvelous and it's great and it's making a real difference. But again, if the skyrocketing demand on the food assistance, the hunger and nutrition front continues to rise, there will not be the resources available. At USAID, traditionally, we separate the two. Humanitarian relief is, quite frankly, among the most politically popular relief out there. Everybody understands the moral obligation that we have as a blessed nation and a blessed people to share in our bounty. Development assistance is often harder. And now with the skyrocketing demand, we may separate them out for accounting purposes, but they aren't really. And they aren't in the minds of policymakers, decision makers. And so I'm really worried about, really selling ourselves short on that front. So there's a dark picture there. There are marvelous technologies and tools that we can put in the hands of community groups and farmers. But if you don't have the resources to do it, it gets to be hard, obviously, to take advantage of it. So those are the dark spots and a few bright spots as well.
Great. Yes, and I think as a former implementer of humanitarian programs, we often saw the distinction between humanitarian and development programs as a problem to implementation. But when you think of it in terms of the humanitarian funding as somewhat more stable, more popular, it's true. The distinction can help sometimes the humanitarians, but it's quite under strain at the moment. So picking up on this idea of systems and how the different systems, whether it's the humanitarian system or the development system, are built to solve these kinds of problems. And this, as we've been thinking about the interconnectedness of these problems, what are the system level changes that you think are needed, whether it's within the UN system, WFP, or within US government as one of the most generous donors? What do you think they need to be changing in order to better address these challenges?
When I was at USAID, one of the things that we tried to do was to do a better job in the metrics that we pulled together. We really need more outcome-based metrics when it comes to food security. We have output-based metrics. We can tell you how many widgets we produce, but that really doesn't cut it, right? What we really need to be doing is developing the characteristics of food security and finding ways to measure the progress on that front, country by country, so that we can help countries undertake the reforms that experience tells us they need to make, but also target the investments. And I think that's a crucial part to it. There's another area, though, that is both a challenge and a need for us in terms of policy reform, and it's related. So if we look at conflict and we look at climate and civil unrest, and we look at those as the triad, if you will, of food insecurity, there's a fourth part to it, and that's human displacement. Of all the things that I encountered when I arrived at USAID, that was what I was least prepared for. So when I was ambassador to Tanzania, Tanzania was home to the largest refugee population on the African continent, about 250,000. That's not even the size of a medium-sized refugee camp these days. The numbers are staggering. 110 million as of May of this year. 40% of those who are displaced are under the age of 18, and every year 400,000 children are born in displaced settings. And so it's a whole nother level of challenge, finding ways to make sure that we are able to get assistance to where it needs to go. Oftentimes, these are young mothers and young children on the move. And then finding ways to empower them with technology that they can utilize while they're in motion and on the move. And that's a significant challenge that I think we have to be undertaking. So bilateral programs like those of USAID, traditionally we go country by country. That's what we're accustomed to, right? We have every mission in each country, and that just doesn't work right now. There are so many people on the move. The most vulnerable amongst us are not where they were and not where they're going to be. And unless we find ways to reach out and empower those individuals, I'm worried that 10 years from now, 20 years from now, we're going to have a whole generation of extraordinarily vulnerable people, vulnerable to the worst kinds of exploitative forces that we can think of. So we have to find ways to reshape our policies so that we're able to reach out and touch people, again, in motion and on the move.
Yes, and I think one of the challenges working in the forced displacement sort of sector and with refugees is that that system, almost like the aid system you were describing that's trying to address food insecurity, is also built for a different era. It was built for even before the Tanzania, the earlier influx in Tanzania in the 70s, but it was really built for a time when refugees didn't stay in their country in the host country for long, and they were really trying to go home. But now, given how long displacement lasts and how complex these crises are becoming, it feels even more so that the humanitarian system and the refugee system is not built for purpose. So going back to your point about food assistance as well, are there lessons that you think both the food assistance realm and this refugee assistance realm that are kind of the part of the broader humanitarian architecture could learn from the development sector? And are there things that you think that sort of more urgent and emergency aid could do better that the development sector does quite well?
Well, you're touching upon, I think, a really interesting policy challenge for agencies like USAID. So not long after I arrived at USAID, we had the Venezuelan crisis. And there are something like 4 million Venezuelans who are now residing in Colombia, and a couple of million more, throughout the region, and also in places like Spain. And that challenge forced us to learn new lessons, to find new partners. On the positive side, I think we are better at taking on issues of fraud, waste, and abuse. One of the things that I always remind the team at USAID is, look, your work's important. In this environment, you're 2 bad stories away from it all going away. We need to scrub every dollar into everything we know how to do. Governor Beasley at the World Food Program, a fabulous partner to work with. He did a really good job of helping us develop biometric fraud markers that helped us take on issues like that. So we saw some positives there that I was really pleased with. But here's another challenge that may not seem like a lot to most people, but in the development space is a big one. So one of the other characteristics of humanitarian relief, the way that the US does it, we tend to work in short-term bursts. The average crisis from when our disaster relief functions were set up was a couple of months. We were dealing with tornadoes, earthquakes, right, volcanoes. And so you mobilize contractors. They went into the field, they were there 3 weeks, they were there 5 weeks, and they went home. And we had pre-positioned supplies in warehouses in different parts of the world. In the era of conflict-driven or tyranny-driven or climate fallout-driven emergencies, they don't go away in 4 weeks, 5 weeks, and 6 weeks. And so the whole model that we had been operating under, in which we rotated groups, teams of contractors to take challenges on, and then go back into their work, doesn't work anymore. And so increasingly, we need to modify the way that we take these challenges on. And so I think you're going to see more and more long-term foreign service officers, civil service professionals, development specialists going into that aspect of emergency relief, because these are prolonged challenges. In some cases, let's face it, they're generational challenges. And so I think that's a major change. It's a new discipline, if you will, in the development sector. What hit me very hard when the Venezuelan crisis occurred, in the way that the steps work, the ambassador, the US ambassador on the ground has to declare an emergency. And that gives the USAID administrator the ability to create what's known as a DART, a disaster assistance response team, and everything gets mobilized. The problem was we had rotated something like 7 DARTs to Cucuta, the border with Venezuela, Colombian border with Venezuela. And I got a call from the mission director who said, that last DART you sent, guess what? We were missing Spanish speakers. And I said, what do you mean? He said, we burned them out. And so now there's a whole new set of challenges in the era of man-made disasters. We have to change our thinking and change our approach and quite frankly, do a better job of being innovative in the field and also bringing the development professionals into that line of work.
Great. And I'm conscious these contexts are also, the Hilton Foundation is focused also on Colombia and the Venezuela crisis. And I was also recently in East Africa. And I think in both places, as you mentioned, not only is displacement a huge issue, but I think the last time I was in Colombia, I heard many more people talking about food insecurity and hunger. And of course, that's always been an issue in East Africa, and food rations
Right.
being cut in Uganda. I'm curious if you're seeing it in other parts of the world. And I haven't been as focused on the Middle East as I used to be, but are there places where the food insecurity is also even more of concern, other hotspots that you can talk about?
Well, in the Middle East, you have in places like Jordan, 1 out of every 3 Jordanians being a Syrian refugee, a Syrian or Iraqi refugee. To give you a sense of the numbers, again, you've got people who are not where they were, and so their livelihoods and their backgrounds are challenged. So the Middle East continues to be a challenge in many ways. And of course, we're seeing through conflict out of the Sahel, we're seeing lots of displaced families heading north to Europe. And that creates a whole new wave of fallout as well. You know, quite frankly, there's been a populism in some parts of Europe that has pushed back, anti-immigrant populism that has been destabilizing and is leading to exploitation and all the wide range of ramifications from that. So I think we also have to think about displacement, food insecurity, and those challenges in European settings as well, which is not something we're accustomed to doing or thinking about. But, you know, we began by talking about changing climate, extreme climate volatility, and its implications. Again, I go back to the nature of the unpredictability of it. And so we're seeing the unpredictability challenging the livelihoods of millions and millions of people, you know, in ways that may not seem like much. So the Wilson Center does a fair bit of work in the Arctic Circle. We work in Greenland and we work with communities in the Arctic Circle. They're seeing their livelihoods go away. They're seeing the movement of schools of fish and fish stocks in ways that challenge their abilities, their way of life. That's a significant issue. There's interesting data out there that shows that the contracting and melting ice cap is actually affecting the monsoon season in parts of Asia. So all of a sudden, from thousands of miles away, from something we never thought about, it's changing the predictability of the monsoon season, which is, of course, what many communities in Asia absolutely depend upon to be able to be food secure. So it is that nature that Kristalina brought up of being a shock-prone world. And what that really means is increasingly in our education, in our civic education, in the skills training that we do, we have to build resilience into it. We have to help prepare people for this sense of volatility so that people have some of the coping skills and mechanisms. And again, it probably sounds remote to a lot of people, but it is this set of challenges that get people in motion, that displace people, that put people on the move. So it really does all wind together. I think you and I would love to be able to compartmentalize these challenges. It'd be great, right? We could, if the issue were solely, I don't mean to make light of it, but a food assistance challenge to East Africa, well, then it would become a challenge of commitment, right? We could actually take care of this. But when you start talking about interlocking and interrelated challenges, including food sovereignty challenges, that's what makes it hard. And so we don't have the luxury of being able to focus on one piece. We really have to do a better job of looking at the larger picture and developing tools and investments that touch the whole spectrum. Because if we don't, we'll fall short.
And you started to talk earlier about some of those kinds of solutions and also about the importance of focusing on outcomes and just data and improving data infrastructure around these challenges. I think it becomes even more complex when you're not just focused on a single sector or a single type of challenge. What kinds of innovative solutions have you seen around data and some of the kind of ways that we're predicting these shocks? I know your point is it's quite unpredictable, and having been in California last week when there was almost a monsoon, I can relate to it. But I think, are there solutions that you've seen that you're really excited about in terms of either better use of data to predict shocks or tracking shocks as they're happening?
Well, so first off, we had some long-standing tools that are very helpful. So we have something called FuseNet, the Famine Early Warning System network that was created by USAID with a USAID grant and then spun off some years ago, which uses satellite data and other forms of data to help predict when a country's on the verge of famine, which allows entities like USAID and the World Food Program and others to pre-position relief supplies. So we do have some of those long-running mechanisms that are still very helpful. But on the very positive side, we have a generation of young people who are innovative, who work off frugal technology, and they're so far ahead of what I could even think of. That really is where my hope lies. So in West Africa, now this is an old program now, but I loved it when I was at USAID. In West Africa, in Ghana, every single day, farmers get 350,000 farmers get an SMS text message that gives them a localized weather forecast for 1 square mile around where they are. It's good for 48 hours and helps them decide on when they should plant and when they need to irrigate. It's extraordinary, and that's simple technology. 3D printers, which are creating mobile weather stations in places like Haiti. So there are all kinds of possibilities that are there. and then also drone technology. In Rwanda, we have the first country where this came up, but it's now in many places. There's a company called Zipline at work, and Zipline can deliver fresh blood anywhere in Rwanda in less than an hour. Extraordinary. So that same technology allows for the delivery of equipment, interventions when it comes to food production. So there are lots of technologies like that I think are giving us additional tools. So again, it's easy to get caught up in the overwhelming nature of the challenge, and yet there's so many bright spots. One other thing that I've seen, my first two trips as administrator overseas, the first one was to the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia, Sudan, and South Sudan. And at that point, Ethiopia was in its 5th consecutive year of drought. And I saw some of the investments that have been made in irrigation systems, in fodder technology that were really exciting and very, very hopeful. My second trip was to Bangladesh and Burma. And I, spent some time in the displaced camps with the Rohingya. And I was looking at some of the technology that was invested there. Again, some of the tools that were provided that were extending education and skills training. And those are very hopeful. And by the way, on the Sesame Street front, Sesame Workshop, great partner of ours in Bangladesh, providing for displaced Rohingya families some, nobody believes it's a replacement for basic education, but it is something that gives them a lifeline in learning. So, that was very uplifting and created reasons to be hopeful.
Great. Yes. One of my first jobs was in Bangladesh, right when Sesame was getting started there. And I will also say they have the most creative and innovative solutions when it comes to dealing with water throughout the country. It's really impressive. So I'll switch gears with one final question and then hand it over to our audience. So everyone out there, think of your questions to pose to Ambassador Green. But we know that the UN General Assembly is coming up, and there will be climate change will for sure be a focus, and we'll be reflecting on the SDGs, and unfortunately not as much progress made as we'd like. But what do you hope will come out of the UN General Assembly this year?
Well, I have to admit to being a skeptic on the SDGs from the bat, in part because I felt they were so broad and so aspirational that sometimes it got to be difficult to measure progress in places where progress is in fact being made. So I like some of the narrower tools of measurement that we developed at USAID. It's not to say that we shouldn't be pushing in the direction that the SDGs laid out. It's that sometimes when we refer to the SDGs, there's a temptation for leaders to say, well, I'm not going to make it. Let's set that aside. So I think most importantly, we have to make sure that we are burden sharing. It's terribly important for the nations of the world, particularly the wealthier nations, but not solely the wealthier nations. Simply put, we have to come together and provide particularly food assistance and emergency relief. We're at risk of losing a generation of young people if we don't. And of course, that is what the UN is there for, being that sense of a forum and collaborative body. But also, quite frankly, on top of that, and this is, I know, a difficult one, we have to push back on Vladimir Putin. I'll give you my straight up bias. We have to defeat Vladimir Putin, get him out of Ukraine, because until Ukraine is back to where it was in terms of food production and its role in the food security chain, it'll be very hard for us to meet some of the needs that are out there. 40% of Ukraine's economy is in agricultural production. 80,000 pieces of agricultural hardware have been destroyed by Russian attacks. So that sets back Ukraine. But what it does that people don't think about, and I don't know if this is still true, but I remember Governor Beasley at the World Food Program telling me that something like 1/3 of all the food assistance commodities, grains in the world were coming from Ukraine and Russia. So when that gets hampered or shut down, it also hits on the other end the food assistance that we provide elsewhere. And of course, when it comes to places like Africa, the lack of altogether, or the lack of affordability in interventions like fertilizer, is a significant problem. A friend of mine in Tanzania, who's one of the largest agribusiness leaders on the continent, said to me that COVID hit Africa, but he said, look, we had a younger population, and quite frankly, we weathered that storm. But not having fertilizer, if my farmers have to go into the field without fertilizer, this year is bad and next year is worse. And so we have to end the conflict. Failing to, I think, is going to prolong some of these food insecurity questions. And of course, if on the obvious side, the human displacement, we have to help people hopefully return home, but at least have the ability to return home.
Yeah, the ripple effects are just enormous. And well, that's a big topic. We can go back to it if we have some time, but I'll take, there are a couple questions from the audience, and I hope others will put theirs in the chat as well. So the first question is from Ibrahim. He says, Ambassador Green, my father is Zanzibari, and he refers to Joshua Busby's article in Foreign Affairs talking about warming world. And he mentioned that archipelagos like the Maldives can face state death due to climate change. And he asks you, based on your visit to my ancestral home, do you think Zanzibar will face this fate?
Well, first off, Zanzibar is like my favorite place in the world. I love Zanzibar and enjoyed the time I spent there. So what I can say, as I had mentioned earlier, I was struck by how the Zanzibaris were already facing the fallout from climate unpredictability, the volatility, and that being both on the crops front, not knowing when they're going to have the opportunity to plant or to harvest, but the changing temperatures of the water and the currents, changing the fish migration patterns. So you've got fish patterns that Zanzibari fishermen and fisherwomen have been able to count on for 1,000 years or more, all of a sudden gone. That creates a huge strain. As I mentioned, I was really struck by, had not heard before, this notion of saltwater seepage, because that's a very significant problem that, again, will threaten livelihoods of all the Zanzibaris. So I'm hopeful, and the Zanzibari people are resourceful, but it is a challenging time for every part of the world, in particular archipelagos and islands.
Yes. And yeah, there's so much creativity and resilience out there. I think we need to foster it and come together around it. There's another anonymous question, I think somewhat around that. This person asks, is there a place that young people can go to build the kinds of technologies, and I think some of the solutions that you were talking about, that they can go to build those technologies and to really help with development and finding solutions?
So there are various humanitarian challenges that are put out by USAID, the Gates Foundation, and others that create the opportunity for young people to come together with different ideas, and those that the evaluators see of being of merit get support. I mean, that's how Zipline and others get going. If you look at our higher education system, a number of the universities, particularly public universities, but not solely, you'll see that there are a number of groups of young people coming together that are looking to apply different ideas and technologies. And I also think I know you'll back this up. Young people should think about service opportunities like the Peace Corps. The Peace Corps, and Tanzania, one of the largest Peace Corps programs in the world, one of the original programs. Young people serving in the Peace Corps, they have their quote unquote day job, right? They may be teachers or whatever it is, but the work that they do in communities to inspire, reinforce, train, highlight in communities all over the world really makes a huge difference. And so I would encourage young people to think about public service opportunities. The good news is it doesn't have to be Peace Corps. When the Peace Corps started, it was really about the only game in town. It was really about the only way that young people could live overseas. And now there are countless ways. There are exchange programs. There are a number of nonprofits, a number of faith-based programs that are out there that provide opportunities. And I would encourage young people to look towards those. It's important to get overseas. It's important to spend time in the developing world. It first off destroys any stereotypes that you may have and preconceived notions, but also you are exposed to people of need, and it's a mutually reinforcing, aspirational way of creating solutions and ideas.
So true. Great experiences all around, and it's great that there are so many options nowadays. So we have another question from an anonymous audience member. How can the U.S. better lead on issues of climate and food security while also holding other countries accountable? And does the U.S. have a leg to stand on when it comes to trying to police emissions from India, China, et cetera?
Complicated question. So first off, I think one challenge that we face is that our political system, as a recovering politician myself, is not really set up well to deal with longer term challenges. And it's something that we have to work harder at. And I'm being somewhat flippant, facetious about it, but so let's talk about tightening our belts, making difficult choices on climate. And 20 years from now, the temperature will only go up by, if we're lucky, 1.5 degrees. There's a bumper sticker that we can put in the back of every vehicle, right? I mean, one of our problems is that we're living in a soundbite society, and we reward politicians who can tell you when the end of the world is, that being the first Tuesday in November in an even-numbered year. What we need to do is change the way that we look at our politicians and communicate with our politicians. We have to reward people who are willing to say difficult things and to make tough choices, and that are willing to make investments that, yeah, you may not see the benefit next November. It sounds like I'm being Pollyannish, but it's got to happen. Otherwise, we're not going to get to where we need to go. The other piece, and it goes back to one of the first blogs that I wrote, Stubborn Thing blogs. What I tried to do is reach out to my fellow Republicans on issues of climate and climate investments, particularly in places like Africa. The numbers show that if the US, Europe, Japan, China, I can't remember if India was included, or no, India I think India was included, all reduced the growth in their emissions by, say 20%, but Africa continues to rise at the same rate it did for the US. One offsets the other, and we're not further ahead. In other words, we need to invest in particular in the developing world to help people in need have access to the energy and technologies they need to rise, develop, grab opportunities, get their seat at the table, all of those things. And it's going to require us to make investments in renewables and help them take those challenges on. And again, being a bit facetious, in my blog post, I said, look, even if you don't care on the morality front about people in the developing world, it's in our interest. We can't meet our challenges if other parts of the world rapidly growing don't meet theirs. We need to be have a helping hand and help them take these challenges on. Good for them, good for us, and the only way that we're really going to find solutions to some of these challenges.
So true. We're very interconnected. So maybe I'll take the privilege of the mic and go back to Russia for our potentially last question. You were talking about the impacts of the war on Ukraine and on we didn't talk so much about the Black Sea Grain Initiative, but when Russia backed out of it, the impact of that on not just Ukraine, but also all the countries that rely on the wheat and corn and other things from Ukraine. I'm curious to hear your perspective on what you've seen as the impact of that, and what we can expect to see in the future, and especially for the most volatile and fragile countries like Somalia and Yemen.
So first off, the restrictions / blockades that Russia imposed early on in the war have had a profound impact, again, on food availability and food prices. And of course, Russia, which initially engaged in a deal and has since walked away from it, those costs are real. And again, those costs hit us in a number of ways. Food prices go up. We understand that that's the immediate. But what it also does, it also takes our assistance and relief money and doesn't go as far. And so it increases hunger and food insecurity for those who are the most vulnerable in the entire world. It is significant. Its impacts are everywhere. On the positive side, I know that the US government is working hard with Turkey and some of Turkey's neighbors to find alternative routes. But make no mistake, those alternatives are not a replacement for getting rid of any restrictions on the Black Sea and allowing for the free flow of food and food inputs. And that really has to take place. And it is worrisome that Vladimir Putin is willing to weaponize food, but it's happening, and it's very clear. God willing, the war is over soon. It has to happen, can't happen fast enough. But I think it's also going to force us, when this is done, to pause for a moment and reconsider what our terminology is when it comes to acts of aggression and acts of war. Attacks upon civilian nuclear sites, attacks upon food infrastructure, hospitals and schools. These are not simply, the immediate impacts are obvious, but what they do to countries that have nothing to do with the conflict are profound. And I think we need to be thinking about those attacks in those terms. And again, it's challenging some of the structures and the framework that we've had for decades. We are in an interconnected world. We're in a world in which commerce flows. And when that commerce is disrupted on the food security front, it hits and hits hard.
And maybe just on that, we had one other question sneak in. So is this something that you think would continuously happen if we don't diversify our systems in supporting other countries who may produce corn and grain?
I think we're seeing the diversification, it will take place.
Mm-hmm.
One of the impacts, of course, of COVID was a shock to our system when we began to realize how vulnerable we were on a number of supply chain fronts. I suspect the same thing is very much underway on the food security front. I think we are going to see a rethinking. But I'm a believer in trade. I'm a believer in commerce. I'm a believer in the flow of goods. I'm a believer in investments in the lowest cost regions and markets. It's good for the world. And so, closing our borders, my opinion, is not the answer. Erecting barriers and tariffs is not the answer. We have to deal with these challenges, but we also have to make sure that we are, both the economics and the socialization that come along with economic statecraft and relations, I think is something that we have to get back to.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Ambassador Green. I'll hand it to you to provide a few concluding remarks before we sign off, but just really appreciate the conversation. I think it's been such a great mix of, there's a lot of, I think, reasons to be worried and anxious in the world today, but it was great to hear some of the bright spots and solutions out there as well. And thank you to everyone for participating and joining us. And I'll just hand it over to you, Ambassador Green, for the last word.
Great. Well, thanks to you, Sarah, and the Hilton Foundation, of course, again, for being such great partners, Jerry Green and the Pacific Council. I'm delighted that these issues are getting taken up. Quite frankly, they don't receive enough attention. It's a heavy topic, and we've laid out a lot of challenges that are out there. But the more I travel, the more I encounter young people with big ideas, big dreams and ambitions and innovation. We also have within our grasp all the tools that we need to take these challenges on. I know it gets heavy, but this last trip I took to East Africa was inspirational. Young people there coming up with ideas that I've never thought of. Really good ideas. So it can get heavy, but there's every reason to be optimistic. We have faced great challenges before. We'll face these, and I'm confident we'll conquer them. So again, thanks to everyone for taking the time to join us, and I appreciate it.
Thank you all. Great to end on that optimistic note. Have a great rest of your